morning, Dr. Logan. Nice to see you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hello, all. Good morning. Welcome to session 2 of the 7th Annual Envision Access Conference and an equity approach to understanding neurodiversity across the lifespan, addressing the needs of African-American students with disabilities. I am Ernie Hall, an adjunct professor and production assistant with the Electronic Media Department here at Ohio University Southern, and I will be your moderator for this session. If you are using captioning, please turn that on by clicking the CC symbol at the bottom of your screen. And if you are following the ASL interpreters, you may pin them at this time to keep them on your screen. The interpreters are Marlene Elliott and Cheyenne Adkins Grant. Your presenter this morning is Dr. Georgiana Logan. Dr. Georgiana Logan is a tenure track assistant professor at Marshall University in the Department of Health Science and adjunct lecturer in the Department of Public Health, where she additionally serves as a research associate in the Minority Health Institute. She received her PhD in health education and health promotion from the University of Alabama and her master's in health education from the University of Michigan. Dr. Logan is a thought-provoking educator and a renowned professional development strategist and mentor with over 20 years of experience in the workforce. She serves on several academic, state, and national health and diversity committees, and has received multiple requests to speak nationally on her research endeavors, which include health disparities, health equity, men's health, environmental justice, and fatherhood. Lastly, she has also received numerous awards, such as being the 2022 Most Valuable Faculty Awardee, 2021 faculty recipient of Marshall University's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award, a 2021 Marshall University Pickens Queen Teaching Awardee, a 2021 John Marshall Leadership Fellow, a 2020 West Virginia Small Communities Big Solutions Power of Performance Changing Lives Award recipient for the Minority Health Institute, a 2020 Marshall University Inspiring Woman in Power Award recipient, and the 2020 Marshall University Outstanding Service Award recipient. The chat window is open for this session. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window. We will pause a few times during the session to check the chat for questions. Before the session ends, I will add a link to the session survey onto the chat. Please take a few minutes to complete this form. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a wonderful introduction. Such a wonderful introduction. And so is it on me? Am I ready to go? Take it away. All right. So good morning and thank you all for attending today's session. I'm excited to be here with you for the Envision Access Conference, right? A great opportunity to kind of address some issues in education and how can we overcome some of those issues and obstacles that we may face. And so I thank the whole entire committee for selecting my presentation. And I'm so excited to present on an equity approach to understanding neurodiversity across the lifespan, really addressing the needs of African-American students with disabilities. And so much like to save time, I am Dr. Georgiana Logan, assistant professor and research associate here at Marshall University. I'm also the director of our Writing Across the Curriculum program in our Center for Teaching and Learning. And then in her absence, I have to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Kristen Allen Watts. If you just joined in, I said she went into labor and had a beautiful baby girl. And so she wanted to be here, but unfortunately she can't. So just keep her and her family in your prayers. And so why are we here, right? Why are we here? Hopefully by the end of this presentation, as a group, that means all of us, we should be able to define neurodiversity and the different types of conditions. We should be able to explore the intersectionality between neurodiversity and social determinants of health. And we want to recommend strategies to building inclusive communities for students who identify as neurodiverse. And so let me start by asking you a question. What do you know and understand about your own learning abilities, right? So I always like to put the focus back on my audience. So I want to start by asking you that question. How do you learn best and why? How do you learn best and why? And you can put it in the chat feature. unmute yourself, whichever you prefer. But how do you learn best and why? What do you know and understand about your own learning abilities?
Hi, this is Tara, and
Hey, Tara.
one of the ways I learn best is by actually doing
Mhm.
whatever skill I'm being shown.
Okay. And I see some people say by observing, through doing. I feel like I learn best through doing as well, seeing and hearing, visual, and kinesthetic. I can't say that word this morning. Kinesthetic. Y'all help me out. Observation and practice, visually, dialogue with others, talking through things, paired with repetition, right? Even for my own self, I learn better by doing, right? Health education, health promotion, public health. It is a practice-based field. So even when I'm teaching my students, I have them do practice-based education, practice-based assignments, right? So a lot of us, we learn better by seeing, by doing, and repetition. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's important that you know that, because when you talk about addressing students who are neurodivergent and have a certain kind of learning ability, it's important to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. And so that translates into your practices when you're working with other students. Good job, good job. All right, so thank you for sharing, which brings us to why we are here, right? Why are we all in this session? And so I want you to know that there are many neurodivergent individuals, and most oftentimes they're misunderstood, undiagnosed, or dismissed with their differences viewed as a weakness, right? Their differences viewed as a weakness. However, neurodiversity is a term that describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits, right? We don't look at people and say, hey, you have a weakness. Because neurodiversity recognizes that cognitive processes are diverse and different. However, traditionally underrepresented groups such as African Americans continue to face barriers to testing, late-stage diagnosis, and access to care that can affect brain development, their adaptive skills, and poor quality of life outcomes, right? You heard me say across the lifespan, so that's from birth to death. We know that little research exists on the experiences of African Americans who identify as neurodivergent, and the lack of cultural responsiveness in neurodiversity research ignores the nuanced experiences of African Americans, which limits the ability to understand their experiences across the lifespan, again, birth to death, and effectively meet their development and learning needs. And so hopefully through this presentation, we'll explore the intersectionality of social determinants and neurodiversity as it relates to African American students with disabilities, while discussing again as a group, all of us, strategies to building inclusive communities for students who are neurodiverse. And so let me ask you another question, because I really want to test the audience. What is neurodiversity? And do you know some of the neurodivergent conditions that exist? What do you already know? Is this a new term for you? Have you not heard it before? What does that term mean to you? What do you know? Okay, I see somebody say ADHD, autism, LD, ASD, ADHD, ADHD. What other conditions have you heard of? What does it mean to be neurodiverse? We all think in different ways. Good job, Jessica. What else? I see ADHD a lot, but what other conditions have you heard of? Do you know? Bipolar, we process things differently. What do you know? What do you know? TBI, mental health conditions, right? A lot of individuals who identify as neurodivergent also have comorbidities, so many mental health conditions that accompany that. We got Tourette's. What else? Psychiatric disability, right. Keep them coming. OCD, okay. You guys get where I'm going. So let me get to my next slide. And so what I want you to know and respect is that we all learn differently, right? We all just put that in the chat, how we learn. And while everyone's brains develop similarly, no two brains function just alike. And so the term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1990s by Australian sociologist Judy Singer. And when we say neurodiversity, it literally describes the variation in the human experiences of the world in school, at work, and through your social relationships that is driven by both genetic and environmental factors, genetics and environmental factors. And so some common causes of neurodevelopment conditions, genetics, right? What mommy and daddy passed down to you. Maybe you experience some kind of trauma at birth, an infectious disease, immune disorders, nutritional factors, sometimes when you don't get the certain vitamins and minerals and nutrients that you need, and physical trauma. And so if you look at the graphic, you all did a great job at naming off some of the neurodivergent conditions. I heard autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, trauma, ODD, specific learning abilities, OCD. Sometimes we have auditory processing disorder, sensory integration disorder. We've heard of giftedness, ADD, Tourette's, right? And this is not all of them. This list is not all encompassing, right? And so just by a show of hands, you can put your, the reaction symbol. How many people on this call identify as neurodivergent or know someone who identifies with one of the neurodiverse categories you just saw, right? We're talking about invisible identities, right? How many people know someone who's neurodivergent or are you yourself neurodivergent? Because a lot of times you hear people talk about visible and invisible identities in diversity research, right? Visible means something that you can see. Invisible, however, means something that you can't readily see or identify just by looking at someone. And I see the hands going up. I see the hands going up. So we have a wide range of people on this call, wide range of people that's on this call. And so there are many different classifications of neurodivergence, each with their own strengths and abilities. Notice I didn't say weaknesses or deficits. I said strengths and abilities. And sometimes we do have certain challenges depending on where you fall at on the spectrum with some of the neurodivergent condition. And so just by looking at some of these, sometimes we know people have difficulty with words. Sometimes there's a lack of concentration or easily distracted. Sometimes temper outbursts or hyperactivity, Tourette's, verbal and physical tics. Sometimes there's poor listening skills, depression, difficulties with planning and coordination, sometimes sensitive to light, noise, touch, speech and language difficulties, and sometimes just problems with communicating, right? Sometimes just problems with communicating. And these are some of the more common neurodivergent, I don't want to say disorder, conditions that you may hear about. So dyslexia, ADHD or ADD, autism spectrum disorder. These are some of the ones, especially in neurodiversity research, that come up most often, And so what does that mean in terms of our statistics? What do we know about our population? What's going on in the US? And so the National Institutes of Health estimates that 15 to 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. So that's a lot of people, right? That's a lot of people. And then the top 3 neurodivergent abilities are dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and autism. And so in the latest report, the 2020 National Center for Education Statistics report, it was found that 14% of public school students ages 3 to 21 receive some form of special education services, with neurodevelopment conditions being the largest category of qualifying disabilities. And in that same report, about 9% of US children have been diagnosed with ADHD, 8 to 10% with a learning disability, and 2% with autism. And so since I am over here in West Virginia, I always like to bring things back home. So what does that look like for me in my state, and then the types of research that I may or may not be able to do based on what we know about our students, right? And so in this report, and this is from the US Department of Education, this is their latest report that they put out, and it talks about the percentage of students with disabilities and a percentage of the population with children ages 5 to 21, and it breaks it down by race and ethnicity. And so what you see is in this graphic, it says for the state of West Virginia, for kids ages 5 to 21, about 88.7% of children aged 5 to 21 who identify as white or Caucasian have some form of learning disability, right? And then you see by the colors, and then if you look, 0.7% of Asians, 3.94% of African Americans or Blacks, and the numbers kind of go on, right? Hispanic, Latino, you can see the colors and put them with the percentages. Now, when you look at the visual on the right, it says by state in the US, outlying areas, and freely associated states. So what that means is, so in the graphic on the left, we're just talking about the whole entire state of West Virginia, right? Really looking at those people who are in K through 12 education all the way through ages 21. However, when you look at the image on the right, even though the numbers are similar and close, when we add in outlying areas and freely associated states, we're talking about children who are also incarcerated, who are in homebound hospitals, residential facilities, separate schools, so schools who primarily focus on students who have behavioral issues, private schools and the like. So it's a whole host of individuals. But again, those numbers are pretty much similar, right? 89.9% of white students, 4.6% of African-American or Blacks, and the list goes on and on. So they kind of just break it out in different kind of categories. And so we're here because we're talking about African-American students, right? And so what I want you to know that over 1 million Black students in grades K through 12 have some form of learning disability. We know that diagnosis or being diagnosed with a learning disability is often delayed by 3 years for Black children compared to white children. So while 3 years may not seem like a lot, that's huge and crucial when we're talking about developmental issues and trying to get kids into care. And disparities in identification are greatest for more subjective disabilities like specific learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and emotional disturbances, where Black students have been overrepresented in special education since the U.S. Office of Civil Rights first started to sample school districts in 1968, not that long ago. So white children are twice as likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis as Black children, who are often instead cast off as being defiant, lazy, or having behavioral and attitude problems, right? Why is that important? Black students are twice as likely to be labeled as emotionally disturbed and 3 times as likely to be identified with the intellectual disability compared to their white peers. Black students are severely underrepresented in gifted and talented programs. And regarding emotional disturbances, students with disabilities make up 75%, that's a lot, 75% of students who are physically restrained. And although Black students make up only 19% of children served by the IDA Act, they make up 36% of students with disabilities who are physically restrained. That's a lot. What that equates to is that 1 in 10 white boys with disabilities are suspended each year, compared to 1 in 4 Black boys and 1 in 5 Black girls. And so nearly 40% of Black students with disabilities leave high school without ever attaining a diploma and instead attain like a GED. So that's crucial. That's good to know. And so what does this look like in the state of West Virginia again, right? And so I always like to bring it back home. And so if you look at this graphic, it talks about total disciplinary removals per 100 children or students with disabilities ages 3 to 21 by race or ethnicity. And so in West Virginia, again, I pulled up the graphic for West Virginia, it says number of disciplinary removals per 100 students with disabilities in the US is 29. So 29 out of 100 students, which equates to over 2 million total disciplinary removals in the US each year. However, in the state of West Virginia, or just let me say a disciplinary removal, if you look at the green graphic, it talks about being defined as any instance in which a child with a disability is removed from his or her educational placement for disciplinary purposes. And that's whether it's in school suspension, out of school suspension, expulsion, and the list goes on and on, right? What's important to know is that in the state of West Virginia, per 100 Black students or African-American students with disabilities, 79 of them are removed from the classroom for one of those instances, right? Either in-school suspension, maybe behavioral issues, drug or weapon offenses, and the like each year. So 79 out of 100 students, 79 out of 100 Black students will be removed from the classroom at some point or another. And the average number for the US is 64. And you can see Black students are being removed from the classroom at higher rates than American Indian or Alaska Natives, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders, 2 or more races, and their white counterparts. That's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. And so I tell you that neurodiversity, because my background is in health education, health promotion, neurodiversity is a public health concern. It's a public health concern, and why? So how many of you on this call have heard of the social determinants of health? How many people are familiar with the social determinants of health? Have you heard that phrase before? Do you know what it is?
Hi, Dr. Logan.
Yes.
Before we go on to that, we do have a comment in the chat. Someone said, Black students are more likely to enter the school to prison pipeline because of lack of cohesive evaluation and supports. They are an underserved population. So I want to add that for what you just said.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Dr. McKenzie. That is so amazing that you saw that. I didn't even see it pop up, but that's right, right? We talk about the prison, school to prison pipeline all the time. And a lot of people may not be familiar what that is, but it has great implications for our African-American students, right? African-American students, and primarily our African-American young boys. And so getting back to these social determinants of health, how many people have heard of social determinants of health? Social determinants of health, you know what it is? Have you heard of it? I know not everyone is from my background with public health and education, but we use this model a lot when we're creating programs or interventions in communities or with individuals to kind of talk about some of those social and outside factors that put people at risk for any kind of disease or sickness and the like, any kind of chance for being successful and well. Any kind of chance for being successful and well. So let me tell you that when I say social determinants of health, I'm talking about the conditions and the places where people live, learn, work, play, and pray that affect a wide range of health risks and outcomes. And so when we talk about, there's 6 domains to the social determinants of health. So when we talk about economic stability, we're talking about people's employment status, right? Are they underemployed, unemployed? What's their income to expenses, their debt, medical bills? What kind of financial supports do they have to make it and be successful in life? When we talk about someone's neighborhood and physical environment, we're talking about their housing conditions, maybe the conditions of the home. We may be talking about, do they rent or do they own their home? Transportation, do you have a vehicle, a car, a bike? Do you more so ride public transportation? What's the safety like in your neighborhoods? Do you have access to parks and playgrounds? Walkability has to deal with the conditions of your sidewalks, if you even have a sidewalk at all, because in some rural areas you don't. Your zip code and geography, it means place matters. So we can look at someone's zip code and determine how long they'll live, a bunch of things that we do in terms of GIS mapping. When we talk about education, we're talking about someone's own literacy skills, right? How well they read, how well they understand numbers, language. Sometimes English is not your first language. Did you have access to early childhood education? Did you have the opportunity for vocational training? So we're talking about like getting an associate's degree or some kind of training, technical training. And did you even have an opportunity to attend college? You know, what's your higher education goals and can you even achieve those? When we look at food, we're talking about hunger or access to healthy options. Do you have a neighborhood in your grocery store in your neighborhood and the like? When we talk about community and social context, we're talking about how well you're integrated and incorporated into the communities in which you live and work, right? Your community engagement. Do you suffer from a lot of discrimination, stress? And when we talk about the healthcare system, we talk about, do you even have access to healthcare? What's the provider availability? So maybe it's in some areas that you live in, maybe the providers aren't doing anything with individuals who identify as neurodivergent. Who specializes in those kind of supports? And then provider, linguistic, and cultural competency. We have to address culture when we're talking about anything, and the quality of care that you receive. And so when you address each 6 of these domains, they play out in your health outcomes, your mortality, your morbidity, your life expectancy, how much you spend in the healthcare system, your overall health status, and your functional limitations, And so since I kind of went over this, I want to know from you all, when you look at these 6 domains, what domains do you think impact learning abilities, and how might that show up in learning inequities experienced by African-American students? Because we're talking about African-American students who identify as neurodivergent, right? So when you look at these 6 categories, what may impact that? What may impact them actually being able to get tested, getting access to services and the like? What do you think?
We have a couple comments in the chat. First is from Tara Smith. She says, this looks similar to the social model for disability. And then she says she loves this and she wants to print it out for her office wall.
That's amazing.
Dr. Scheidel said social determinants of health is a social work grand challenge.
Yes.
And then Dr. Montage said that, Tara, that's a great idea. putting on a wall in their office.
Right. So we don't forget, right? Because a lot of times we like to victim blame is what I call it. But there's many, many reasons why health outcomes, learning outcomes, just overall well-being, being able to get a job in the first place, right? When you talk about individual learning abilities, what may be some of those barriers for preventing them from being successful in society, right? How does this show up when you talk about individuals who identify as neurodivergent? And what do we know about low-income communities, communities of color, rural communities, and the access that they have to different services, and especially for our children? Terry, is your hand up? I see a hand up as well.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm shaking my head vigorously at everything you've just been saying. And I'll just, full disclosure, I'm a mom to a disabled autistic kiddo. He's white, we're middle class. We got diagnosis right away. We had access to everything. It wasn't easy, but we had access to everything to apply for it. And this is exactly, people say to me, to my face, it's okay that you're getting help, or it's okay that you're receiving some type of social welfare. And it drives me insane because people don't stop to look at all of these determinants are whether or not the person's going to get help. And we know that our Black siblings, our Indigenous siblings, our people of color siblings, these social determinants are just working against them constantly. So I'm very excited that you're sharing this, and probably will print it out from my wall so I can show it to everybody.
Please do. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for being vulnerable and transparent about you being a parent who has a child who identifies as neurodivergent. So we thank you for that. All right, so let's move a step forward, right? Because we talked about intersectionality. And what does this look like between neurodiversity and the social determinants of health, right? So I'm kind of throwing a lot of different concepts out to you really, really quickly. And so what I want you to know, when you hear the term intersectionality, it was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the experiences of living with multiple identities. So whether you're overlapping gender and race, culture, disability, sexual orientation, immigration status, all of these different categories that people identify as, right? You overlap those things together, multiple identities. That's what we mean by intersectionality. So in this case, we're talking about African Americans with some form of learning disability, or in my case, ability, right? Some kind of learning ability. But historically, disability services were designed to accommodate a singular identity, a person with a disability, a person with autism spectrum disorder. And all other aspects of individual experiences were considered secondary. So don't even start talking about those social determinants of health, let alone putting race, cultural, sexual orientation, or your immigration status on top of those things. What we know is that Black students are often not treated with the same level of compassion as their white counterparts, and that is no different when it comes to neurodivergence and mental health care. So a lot of times, when an individual identifies as neurodivergent, they also have some kind of mental health condition tacked onto that, whether it be anxiety, depression, the like. And so ignoring the lived experiences of discrimination and racism through the structures and systems has created and exacerbated inequities within our disability services. And it was found that 65% of students with disabilities graduate high school compared to 84% of students without a disability. However, only 57% of Black students with disabilities graduate high school compared to 75% of Black students without disabilities. So even though those numbers are kind of similar, it's a lot. That's a big difference. And inequities in economic stability, neighborhood and the physical environment, education, food, community and social context, and the healthcare system places African American students at greatest risk for facing barriers to testing, late-stage diagnosis, and access to care that can affect their brain development, adaptive skills, and poor quality of life outcomes. And so when we start talking about how does that show up, or how do those barriers show up in African American students' physical, mental, and behavioral outcomes, we have high rates of stress, anxiety, depression, so it's affecting their mental health negatively. Black students who are neurodivergent often have poor health outcomes, more likely to experience bullying, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to be obese, which leads into other health, chronic health conditions like hypertension and diabetes, which we know African Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely to be hypertensive and diabetic. And they also lead to increase in fighting, right? Increase in fighting. Maybe it's a result of bullying. Maybe it's a result of some stress, anxiety, and depression. All of these things overlap each other, which lead to some of those behavioral issues that oftentimes African-American students kind of get in trouble with, right? So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And so I have some strategies to promote equity among neurodiverse students that I want to share with you. So what can we do about it? And especially as a teacher, right? So I teach college students over here at Marshall. And when you consider your overall aesthetics of your classroom, I told you that some individuals with certain neurodivergent conditions are sensitive to sound. So do you offer quiet spaces and noise canceling headphones, right? First of all, how much do you know about the students that you're actually serving, right? If you work in K through 12 education, maybe you have school uniforms, right? Maybe we need to modify them in some form or fashion. Movements, flexible seating, breaks, fidget toys. A lot of times people will say, hey, sit in your seat, don't get up, don't move. But you know, there's things that you can do to kind of offset some of that stuff. Lighting modifications. Sometimes the room is just too bright. Can we dim those lights in some form or fashion to accommodate our students who are neurodivergent? And then something else that people don't consider is the room color and the pattern scheme. So sometimes as teachers, you know, we like all of these bright colors, these different patterns on the wall, and we don't take into consideration how that could affect our students and their learning outcomes and their ability to show up and be present in the classroom. Yes, I see a hand up. I see a hand up. Please feel free to stop me at any time.
So, you know, I teach on the Southern campus. I teach at OU Southern. And, you know, and I work with Dr. McKenzie, and one of the things that, and I teach social work. So one of the things that we find, or at least I find, is number one, students come out of high school and don't want accommodations because they want to do it on their own. They want to try it on their own. Get that. Second thing is, if they don't ask for accommodations, then in the classroom, we may just go on and teach, however, and everybody seems engaged until we get halfway through. And, you know, I am a proponent of universal design. I like to get students, you know, I try to do all the different things, but at the same time, if we're not informed, we can't intentionally create a safe space, especially if a student doesn't share, which often they don't, you know. And so, you know, I think that that's something that I try to look out for. Now I'm trained in it, but think about, you know, other professions who might just think of students being belligerent or just not showing up in class.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much. That's so true, right? So we have a lot of work to do. And even over here at Marshall, we don't receive any kind of training to being able to interact with neurodivergent students, right? So even that's a barrier for us. So if we can't readily identify some of the common, well, what do you want to call it? Common, want to use the right word. Some of the common ways in which students, you know, struggles, some of the common struggles. I don't always like to use deficit terms, right? But some of the common struggles that students face and how they show up based on their conditions that they identify with, that's a huge barrier in the classroom, right? So we have a lot of work to do. And even when you consider your interaction with your students, do you practice clear communication, right? Sometimes we just start talking, we write things down on paper and our assignment instructions, and we just assume that everybody understands what we planned out in our own special heads, right? It makes sense to us on paper, it makes sense when we said it, but does it make sense to our students when we actually ask them to do certain things? And so I tell you to ask their personal preferences, right? I asked you all in the beginning, how best do you learn? How many people who are professors or teachers ask their students in the beginning, hey, how do you learn? What do you think works best, right? Because a lot of times we get stuck in our own pedagogy methods, right? We give tests, we give quizzes, we may give long intensive writing assignments, and that may not be conducive to a student who identifies as neurodivergent. And then also providing precise and detailed instructions, right? Again, sometimes what we put on paper makes sense to us, but then a lot of times, even me as a professor, students ask me all the time, Dr. Logan, what do you mean by this? What am I supposed to do? And I thought it made perfect sense, right? But again, everybody comprehends and understands things differently. You got to be patient, right? You got to be patient. If you are in the field as a teacher and just working out in communities with folks trying to change lives, we have to have a lot of patience. We also have to practice inclusivity in your planning. So in your course planning, right? In the beginning of the semester or the beginning of the school year, how often do you incorporate the ideas of your students into your lesson plans, right? And how do you include them in the classroom? We talk a lot about removing students, right? Because they have X, Y, and Z learning abilities. And sometimes that's necessary. But what can we do to really make people feel included in our classrooms? You have to identify culture. You have to address it. You cannot get around it, especially when you start talking about African-American students. There's a lot of stigma that goes into being diagnosed with some form of neurological disorder or condition, right? And you have to address that. If not, you will not be effective in creating programs, interventions, course assignments, whatever the case may be, when it comes to your minority or ethnic identifying students. And then you have to be able to provide resources, right? What services are offered in your communities? Are they free resources? Do you get the information out to parents, to the students? What are you doing on your college campuses? We just started a Neurodiversity Alliance group here at Marshall. It's led by Professor Dr. Jill Underhill. She's had panel discussions on neurodiversity. I actually have a couple students who served on that panel that's in my classes right now, that educate me all the time about their conditions. And I have to be flexible sometimes, right? Even with my assignment deadlines, be flexible. I know that we like to stick to these tight schedules and deadlines, but be flexible, be flexible. Yes, Dr. McKenzie, you got your hand up.
Yes, we have a couple of comments in the chat. People have really strong ideas about this and thoughts. I want to start with the first one is, I feel like the pandemic has caused a rise in neurodivergence. I've noticed there are more students requesting accommodations for testing these past couple of years. And then next, Dr. Scheidel said, I tell my students, I think I make perfect sense. I know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't understand, let me know and I'll explain it in 15 different ways if you need to. Tara says, Rebecca, that is great that your students are getting words around their lived experience and feel comfortable to ask you for help. And then Sarah said, yes, Joy is wonderful. She's a student at opening the door to us students on how she can best teach and serve us. And then Sarah also said, I know I've discovered a lot about myself within the last year and how I learn best and what I need to have to be successful. And I've never addressed before. And then Melody said, such great points. I'm a big fan of living syllabus.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. Yes, right. Sometimes I said as professors, we get stuck in our ways, right? We got to teach these many chapters. And if we don't make it through this material, the whole semester is off. No, it's not. We're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I tell everyone, my mother passed away a couple weeks ago, and it threw off my whole syllabus, right? I'm teaching on campus, and now I'm teaching virtually all the way in Michigan, right? And so some of the classes, I didn't get a chance to teach some of them lectures, and it's okay. I posted them on Blackboard and say, read at your own convenience, right? And so when we think about policy and practice considerations, what do we do? Because we're talking about education system, right? So we have to look at our states and our districts, and what do we do in those processes, right? And so I tell you that we need to seek out outside expertise on disability identification that accounts for linguistic and cultural differences. Again, I'm talking about for African-American students, right? But these really are for all students when you think about it, right? The presentation is just on African-American students. You have to invest and prioritize hiring educational professionals with an expertise in a wide range of cultural and linguistic experiences, right? So a lot of times when I'm doing my work and I identify as African-American, I tell folks, I don't always have to have someone who looks like me. I need to have someone who understands my experiences. I don't care if you're white, purple, green, blue, turquoise, whatever color it is, right? I'm more so looking for somebody who can understand me, right? Because sometimes just because I get somebody that looks like me, that doesn't mean that they have my best interests at heart, right? And if they haven't experienced what I experienced, it may be more of a problem than a help. You have to address your biases, right? What do we think we know about people who are neurodivergent? What are the areas where we need to be educated in to help us be better professionals? And you need to develop relationships with your students and their families to better understand a student's neurodiversity. This is a new phrase for a lot of different individuals, a lot of different communities, and a lot of different aspects, right? So you need to talk to people. You need to talk to your families, and you need to talk to your students. And some things that districts can specifically do, which is modify your discipline policies, right? Is that student really behaving bad? Is it something that we miss? Try to figure out what's going on. Suspending students from school, we know that sometimes it is necessary, but can we go about it a different way? Implement and provide training to educators and multi-tier systems of support, universal design for learning. We heard somebody talk about that. Positive behavioral interventions and supports, and culturally responsive teaching and restorative practices. We want these students to stay in school. We talked about the low percentage of African-American students who get expelled from school, who never even graduate with a college degree, and especially if they suffer from some kind of neurodivergent condition. Diversify the school culture from a top-down approach. Everybody from the principal to your school board, your administrators, your assistant teachers, everybody needs to bring something to the table, right? We need to diversify that. And you need to collect data. How many individuals in your school identify as being neurodivergent? What are those conditions like? What are the areas that they may need? We need to collect data. And if you live in the state of West Virginia, our data collection is behind across the board. And then the U.S. Department of Education must continue to enforce the equity and IDA regulations and provide intensive technical assistance to states and districts with the highest levels of significant disproportionality. So those are your rural communities, your low-income communities, your marginalized communities, your African-American communities or minority communities and the like. And so let me ask you this, because again, I always bring it back to the audience, right? How do we, that's all of us on this call, how do we promote change for all students and for African-American students and students of color at our schools and in our classrooms? And so I'm going to ask you again, what will you do to address neurodivergence and students who identify as neurodivergent in your classroom, right? So I'm putting the stuff back on you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to address neurodivergence and students who identify as neurodivergent in your classroom? You can unmute yourself, you can put it in the chat. What you gonna do? I'll tell you, for me personally, this is a new field for me as well. And I really need to do some more research on this neurodivergence area, right? I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. I just came to tell you all a little bit about a little bit.
I want to share that. I think the first thing we have to, first of all, I'm neurodivergent.
Okay.
Very, and my students all know this, but I think the first thing we have to do is normalize it by talking about it. Because I got to tell you, I think everybody might have a little bit of neurodivergence in there somewhere. But I just think until we normalize it in the classroom and the conversation and letting students know that it's okay to think differently and erase that stigma, that's where the conversation needs to start on the ground with the students. I know Teresa does, Dr. McKenzie does an excellent job working with students, but we have to continue that into the classroom.
Thank you for sharing. What about somebody else? What are you going to do?
Sorry. I agree with Joy. I'm one of her students. I didn't really know a lot of the things or the ways I thought about things or the ways I learned really had a name. And I have a friend who is a therapist and talked a lot about herself being neurodivergent. And so I started to explore that. Okay, like maybe this is why I am this way. And so I think normalizing it, getting it out there that there's a name for these things. There's, a reason that you might be feeling these ways or have different ways that you learn. So I think normalizing it is super important and getting that education out there so people can identify.
That's right, Sarah, right? We talked about it in the beginning. Everybody learns differently, right? We all neurodivergent in some aspect or another, right? Whether we're officially diagnosed and we want to put a name to it or not, we are all neurodivergent in some way or another. And so what are two things your school can incorporate into practice to address inequities experienced by African-American students or just students across the board who identify as neurodivergent? What do you think your school can do? What are we not doing? What you'd like to see happen? I told you we just started a Neurodiversity Alliance on the campus of Marshall, and a lot of faculty, students, and staff are very, very excited about it.
I think here at Southern Ohio, one of the things that we've started doing is we make sure that we have accessibility services, a presence at orientation or in the online orientation, but we make sure we have a presence and we talk about disability service, accessibility services. We list a random listing of possible diagnoses so that students know that it's not limited to what they may have learned in high school and secondary ed. So we make sure that that information is out there from the beginning. I teach a freshman class. And so in my class, I talk about anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, the impacts of those disabilities on the learning process, but also talk to them about different learning styles so that we all can discuss all of our learning styles, not just for those students who have lived with, learn with disabilities. So I think those are two things that I do, but I know for us at Ohio, having our presence more visible for accessibility services is key for students to get that at the beginning.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. McKenzie. Yes, 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 right? I tell my students all the time, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you, right? It's gonna be okay. We all learn differently. So don't get into that negative mind space that, you know, you have a deficit or that you can't learn or X, Y, and Z, right? We want to encourage and support those students. And for the sake of time, I ask you to think about this after you leave this presentation. What policies can we advocate for in efforts to address neurodivergence in education? So now I'm talking about at a local level, at the state level, at the national level, through policy, right? Whether it's an internal policy or external policy. What can we do? How will you utilize your voice to get those individuals in office to pay attention to the services, the monies, and the resources that we need to really make an impact in our communities of color, to make sure that they're getting tested, diagnosed, and getting access to the resources that they need to really develop well across the lifespan, right? This stuff trickle down into like your educational outcomes, your employment outcomes, right? It has a huge effect on someone's life across the lifespan. And so let me leave you with this.
We have one comment that might connect to the idea of policies. Melody said, educate professors about how to better comply with accommodation requests and how this is a legal requirement of them in certain cases. So they can't just say no laptops or something like that. And I connected to policies because when I was working on my doctorate, I looked at training adjunct faculty members and working with students with disabilities or universal design for learning, because there's not a lot of training there. So a policy could be created where a requirement for employment is they go through training on accommodations, accessibility services, ADA, before they are in the classroom in front of students.
Right, and I think it even goes beyond just training, right? Let us look, I told you I'm the director for writing across the curriculum. So I'm looking at people's syllabi all the time, right? Hey, do you know how to teach a writing intensive class? And what does that look like through writing assignments? And so maybe even incorporating that and maybe a Center for Teaching and Learning, right? How is your syllabus, neurodivergent friendly, whatever the case may be, right? And trying to meet these benchmarks and standards to say, hey, we got some work to do. We got some work to do. And so the World Health Organization noted that the prevalence of neurological conditions is one of the greatest threats to public health, right? I'm a public health official. And so I say that the World Health Organization tells you that there are several gaps in understanding the many issues related to neurological disorders, but we already know enough about their nature and treatment to be able to shape effective policy responses to some of the most prevalent among them. And so I thank you for listening to my presentation. My contact information is on here. I could only give you a snippet. of the things I know, right? If I had more time, I would continue this conversation. But again, thank you for listening. My phone number is listed there as well as my email address. And I had a wonderful time. Thank you all for participating.